All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode from Wisdom is Prism podcast. Today, I'm honored to host Dr. Hasan Spiker. He has spent his formative years in Cambridge, England, before moving to the Middle East, where he spent 12 years studying the classical Islamic intellectual sciences and completed his memorization of the Quran, and then read philosophy at the University of London and took a master's in philosophy in philosophical theology at Cambridge, where he's also been affiliated with the Center for the Study of Platonism. And he has taught at Zaytuna College in Berkeley. He's a researcher at the Taba Foundation in Abu Dhabi. He is the author of Things as They Are, Nafs al-Amr, and the Metaphysical Foundations of Objective Truth, that I had a hard time really going through. It was a lovely read. And then he's got another book called Hierarchy and Freedom, an examination of some classical metaphysical and post-Enlightenment accounts of human autonomy. Then he has also written another book entitled Meta-Critique of Kant and the Possibility of Metaphysics. Additionally, The Unraveling of Intelligibility, Elements of Modernity. He's one of the very few people working today who is genuinely at home in the later Kalam tradition, in Akbarian metaphysics, and in the Platonic tradition as a living philosophy rather than a history. Welcome, Dr. Hasan. It's an honor to host you.
Habibi, it's a great honor for me. Thank you so much.
Definitely. Our pleasure, sir. It's been a few years that you have been under my radar, so to speak, in order to get you on the podcast, on my own podcast. So let's right away get into the heart of our discussion. So we're going to be discussing about Nafs al-Amr, objective truth, autonomy, freedom, and what have you. Starting with the book, Things as They Are, the Foundations of Objective Truth. So this book centers on the classical concept of Nafs al-Amr, the fact of the matter, things as they are. I wouldn't say things in themselves, because I think you want to make a distinction between the two, right? So for listeners meeting this term for the first time, could you unpack it a little bit? What is Nafs al-Amr, and why is it critical for Muslims and believers in general to be acquainted with it?
Sure. I mean, it comes down to the Arabic phrase صدق القضية مطابقتها لنفس الأمر, right? So what is the truth of a proposition? What does it mean for a proposition to be true? Is it's corresponding to nafs al-amr, right? It's corresponding to reality, to al-waqi', to the way things really are in themselves. It's entirely straightforward word to translate, but it's not that much of a big deal either. It's not one of those words which really gets you tearing your hair out. The point is that when we want to account for truth, how is it possible, right, to make true statements about realities which, let's say, are non-empirical, right, which are realities where there's not a simple correspondence to a sensible particular object, right? So, the Aeneads is on my shelf, that red book, My statement clearly corresponds to it being on my shelf there. So it's not really an issue, right? But if I was to say that moral realism is true, right? If I was to say that we can ground moral judgments in objective reality, right? That's an entirely different thing. There's no empirical object that I can point to and say, well, it's that thing that makes it true, or it's that thing that makes it true, right? Fundamental logical principles, right? Like the principle of non-contradiction, okay? We know that it's true. We know that discursive truth depends upon this principle being true, right? And yet, what is it in reality that it corresponds to that makes it true, right? So essentially, Nafs al-Amr is the question of how it is possible for there to be objective truth, okay? We make a statement and it is validated by something about reality. So what it really comes down to is how broad is your conception of reality going to be, Okay. On materialism, and even more specifically on empiricism, grounding your statements about moral propositions or aesthetic propositions or metaphysical propositions is already ruled out a priori, which is ironic, isn't it? Because in empiricism, you're not supposed to be allowed to have anything a priori, right? So all of these sciences are ruled out a priori. So this is why the question of nafs al-amr is really the great question of our time. The book was commissioned by Taba Foundation. You said in your introduction that I'm a researcher with Taba Foundation. It's true that I was a researcher with them for 8 years until 2022, and it was a wonderful time. And they commissioned that work. But when you consider our situation today on so many different levels, intellectually speaking, in terms of the intellectual impasse that the West has arrived at, and in terms of the state of Muslims, in terms of our orientation, our situatedness, epistemologically speaking, but more fundamentally, it's a spiritual state, a spiritual crisis in some sense. The question of how an objective sciences of metaphysics, of aesthetics, and of ethics are possible is extremely, extremely urgent. Because one of the great dogmas of modernity, broadly speaking, is that truth, beauty, and goodness are merely subjective, right? And the thing is, when we buy into a kind of blind faith model of religious faith, and we lapse into a kind of identitarianism about our Islam, and we make this split between what we believe in, right, which is our creed, and then what we know, which is informed by the fundamental assumptions of the modern academy and the ascendant metaphysical assumptions of our time, even though they don't admit that they're metaphysical, but of course they are metaphysical. Exactly as we said, they are smuggling in a priori metaphysical assumptions, right? While all the time saying, well, we don't really believe in metaphysics, we're empiricists, we're materialists, there's nothing there. But that in and of itself is a metaphysical position. So we tend to come into those conditions. It informs our educational system. We think of, modern education. It's just modern. It's just neutral. It's just education. It's how you get educated. You hear about Muslims saying he's educated. He's a doctor. He's an engineer, whatever. But we're drinking in subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, but subtle metaphysical assumptions and presuppositions from our environment. It becomes the air we breathe, and we don't realize that it is giving us, right, a soul, okay, right, which is not a Muslim soul. Right? It's giving us, it's actually really threatening our fitrah, right? It's threatening our fitrah on a very, very deep level. And the danger of it is it's an orientation towards the world, towards knowing. It's assumptions about what is knowable. And the frightening thing is it's fully compatible with someone memorizing their creed and praying 100 rak'ahs a day. Right. And yet on the level of Iman, some of the great masters of our tradition would question whether they even have it. Right? Because, as you know, it presupposes and involves knowledge. Iman is a knowledge of God, right? It's a knowledge of the reality of prophethood. It's not blind faith, right? So, the whole blind faith model of religious belief the full story is obviously a very complex story, but a broadly true narrative is that we are essentially blindly following a Lutheranism, right, which is very, very idiosyncratically Western European Christian because of fundamental beliefs in Christianity about how original sin is supposed to have irredeemably stained our intellect, right? Intrinsically. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just the human condition. So that the human mind cannot even know metaphysical or theological truth in principle, right? So this mind only works for the material world. It only works for the immanent world. And so your faith, because your faith also, incarnation, a God-man, a suicidal God-man, Trinity, a three-headed God, is antagonistic, intrinsically antagonistic to reason. And what you have to remember about Luther is that he was a Ockhamist trained philosopher. And so one of Ockham's most important contributions, if you will, was to show, because he was probably the most advanced logician of the Middle Ages, that the Trinity, as opposed to the position of Thomas Aquinas, which dominated the so-called High Middle Ages, formally contradicts logical form. So is formally contradictory, rather. So Luther essentially takes the baton. If the most important facts about reality, according to that vision, the incarnation, the Trinity, are opposed by reason, which one do you think you're going to throw out? The Trinity, the incarnation, or reason? You're going to throw out reason.
Right. Exactly. So I think that paved the way for Immanuel Kant later in order to have the psychological conditions in order to eliminate any possibility for metaphysics, because reason is very, very limited because of the original sin, and these all like a domino effect. I think these are all related, and one of the things that you said, I think Occam rejected forms, right? Is that what you said, right? It reminded me, I think it was Ibn Sina that said, form is true actuality and matter is potentiality. So it was a reverse picture prior to the modern shifts that happened after the collapse of the Thomas Aquinas' synthesis that permeated every corner of, say, Christendom. That was still better, all things considered, than what came later, that with the collapse of the possibility for metaphysics, the soul sort of gets into this state of agitation, and there's all sorts of existential angst, as Viktor Frankl puts it, that faces the human being and ultimately degrades the fitra, hence the connection severed between the human and the creator, and hence ultimately unhappiness will ensue from any worldview that takes metaphysics away by using a faulty metaphysics. And I want to ask you also about how modern thought is saturated with what you call routinely applied leitmotifs of doubt. Like we've got the offshoots of subjectivism, nominalism, relativism, what have you. And which of these do you consider as the most negatively formidable that led the other ones in a way?
Well, Kant famously says, I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. And if you look a little bit more deeply into Kant's intellectual milieu and his real life backdrop, and also his stated intent, this statement of his that I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith is motivated by his Lutheran pietism. Pietism was a kind of especially puritanical version of Lutheranism. And so there's this strange mistaken directionality that his project for dismantling theoretical metaphysics, traditional metaphysics, what he calls dogmatic metaphysics and the critique of pure reason, is actually motivated by a prior theological commitment, right? Now, actually, when I was talking about Occam, what I was saying is not that he denied form in the sense of the Hyula and Sora, because he actually affirms form. It's a kind of myth about Occam that he doesn't affirm the existence of immanent form. He explicitly affirms it, following Aristotle. There are actually very clear texts about that. What I was saying is that Surat al-Qiyas, right, the form of Qiyas, you've got like a Shakl Awal, Shakl Thani, etc., the first and second figures, so on. What he was saying is the Trinity formally contradicts logic, right, in that sense, in terms of formal logic. So what is the most fundamental challenge, the one that poses the most serious of a threat to us today, is much more than just some sort of vague word like relativism or whatever it happens to be. It's an inherited vision of the world which takes as its starting point very, very deep assumptions. In this particular case, the split between knowing subject, right, and the extramental world. The idea that somehow the extramental world, right, what can be known objectively, is a very, very limited kind of world. It's a world which essentially amounts to physical properties, right? And there are different enumerations of these physical properties, but that is the proper object of study for the natural sciences, right? And those are the only objectively binding sciences. And then all of the most important questions of human concern, essentially those related to truth, beauty, and goodness, right? So the traditional sciences of metaphysics and ethics, and then, what we'd call today the science of aesthetics is not so much a traditional science, but it's certainly a traditional area of investigation, are consigned to the level of pure subjectivity, right? So this is a very, very deep assumption for the modern person, including the modern Muslim, just as much as anybody else, really. Illa ma rahma rabbi, So essentially, where does this belief come from? There are so many different aspects to it, and we don't need to get waylaid by all of them. Descartes, with the so-called Cartesian split, plays a serious role, and then that becomes intensified by Kant, who essentially runs with that Cartesian baton and turns it into something even more trenchantly beyond hope and help. But the most fundamental thing, I would say, is how a methodological choice, as I always say, a methodological choice that was made, a methodological choice, a choice, not a claim about what is there in reality, a choice, right? That was essentially the consensus of the major thinkers of the scientific revolution. So I'm talking about people like Francis Bacon, Galileo, René Descartes, Robert Boyle, and other similar figures, which was, in this scientific revolution, we are revolutionizing the study of nature, right, of physical nature, because we want to shift the fruits of that investigation from contributing to a subordinated model of the sciences culminating in metaphysics, which is essentially there in order to give us knowledge of the fundamental nature of reality and ultimately of the divine, right? So shifting it from that to an aspiration for the fruit of study of the natural world to be giving us mastery of the physical world, even if that involves, and in fact it very much will involve, the instrumental exploitation of nature in order to serve man's material needs. That is to say, the study of natural science, what we call today natural science, was reconfigured in order to serve what we today call technology, right? And what needed to be done in order to achieve this, and they're very explicit about that. Again, it was a methodological choice. It's not saying reality really is likewise, this is the metaphysical essence of nature, okay? It's not a theophany. It's not in any sense a revelation of God's nature. It's not in any sense a theophanic manifestation of divine signs, right? It's not, it doesn't have essences. It doesn't have purposes. They weren't saying this as a metaphysically worked out conclusion. What they were saying is, if you want to use nature in order to knowledge of the natural world in order to create with its predictive power and by adapting means to ends through experimentation, right? In order to create technology, you need to treat it as if there are no purposes or final causes, and there are no formal causes, right, which are essences. And you also need to remove secondary qualities. So there are only primary qualities there. There's only, which are essentially quantitative properties, right? And figure, bulk, number, extension, etc., right? Mm-hmm. Because it is mathematics and viewing the natural world as somehow purely quantitative, which gives us the predictive power and control in order to use experimentation and adapting means to end to create technology. We need to treat nature as if it is a mechanism. It's not that it really is in its innermost essence. It may well be more than that. But the great thinkers of the scientific revolution said, we need to treat it as if it is not, okay, in order for this new science to be able to be fruitful in the way that we need it to be fruitful, which is essentially allowing us to master nature, harness it for material, the greater material gain of mankind. Now, what happens is that methodological choice in the unfolding of history becomes concretized and mistaken for a categorical truth, a consensus verdict about the nature of reality, right? Because at the same time you have this corresponding decline in the study of metaphysics, a subjectivization of these great questions of ultimate human concern, while at the same time you have this reification of what I said is a methodological choice, as if it's a metaphysical truth that, oh, no, all that's there in nature, it's blind and it has no purpose and it has no meaning, right? Which is, again, was not justified metaphysically, but was merely a methodological choice.
Right. So there are a couple of points that were really interesting. One is it reminded me of man being the measure of everything, right? I think that originated from the independent, autonomous agent that could work independently of God. I think Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age, talks a lot about how exclusive humanism, first it was humanism, right? That human independent thinking from early modern thought, like from Francis Bacon on the empiricist side and from Descartes on the rationalist side. But from both of these streams and these sides, they sort of took themselves to be the arbiter of truth. And then came the downfall of metaphysics. I think this is hubris. For me, when I look at it, this is nothing other than thinking that you are the independent agent. I think they were believers as well. I mean, Francis Bacon, Descartes, they did not deny God or metaphysics as such. They didn't want to deny it, but as an offshoot, as a logical consequence of the agent being God, then we will have a flattened world, as Charles Taylor says, from humanism to exclusive humanism. That is the immanent frame. That is, everything could be explained from the causal closed universe. Then the need for God would be eliminated, and then hence we have deism. And then after deism, we have expressive individualism, that expressing your individual autonomy, your desires, would be the thing to be done. That is the ideal to be aspiring. We're going to later talk about expressive individualism in the hierarchy and freedom as well. But I just wanted to say that science fundamentally is about the behavior of nature. It is never meant to describe what things are in themselves, right? And this method, as you said, methodological choice was, was a metaphysical expression as well of the prior things that were happening, as I said, from Descartes, from Bacon onwards. And metaphysics is about what things as things in themselves, or things as they are, which are never explored by science. So Kant is very interesting that you pointed out. And we've got two philosophers that I think when we talk about the history of philosophy, we say after Socrates or after Plato and after Kant or prior to Kant. So Kant is just such an influential figure, for better or worse. What were the implications of Kant when he died and later? What were the salient implications that influenced Western thought onwards?
Well, Kant in his own lifetime was widely refuted. It's not at all that his ideas took hold just cleanly like that without any pushback. There was very strong pushback and very, very powerful refutations of Kant within his own lifetime. In fact, in one of my books, The Metacritique of Kant and the Possibility of Metaphysics, I go through in one of the chapters those contemporary refutations of Kant. So there was a very, very strong pushback in his own lifetime. And yet he in the end triumphed because he matched the spirit of the age. He was essentially perfectly describing the spirit of the age. It's what people wanted to hear. What are the implications of Kant? Well, one of the most important and significant implications, consequences or just historical realities, is that the two major streams of philosophy after Kant that emerge in the contemporary period, namely what we call analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, although they're absolutely at each other's throats on almost every issue that you can think of, and we think of them as diametrically opposed to each other, it's an incontrovertible fact, nonetheless, and this is very richly documented. There are plenty of references in my book, Things as They Are, which show which bring out the studies of it. It will essentially open up the literature to anyone who's interested. That the analytic and continental streams of philosophy are both offshoots of Kant, and although they differ very fundamentally in all sorts of different ways, they both agree very profoundly with very, very few exceptions. So few exceptions, it's not even really worth mentioning. They both agree, the analytic tradition and the continental tradition, with one of Kant's most important doctrines. It really is what Kant's all about, which is the rejection of the possibility of metaphysics in the traditional sense of metaphysics, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So essentially a science which can give you objective knowledge of the general structure of reality, what's called by Wolff general metaphysics, and can also give you objective knowledge about metaphysical entities like the nature of God, the existence of God, the nature of God, the nature of the soul, right? Mm-hmm. And other matters like our survival, the survival of our incorporeal spirit after bodily death, like the nature of human freedom, and so on. So there's a general consensus after Kant that traditional metaphysics is impossible. And that is not some sort of luxuriant incidental point that intellectuals pointlessly talk about. That has immense consequences. It has immense consequences for the everyday shape of reality. It's why you have the kind of job that you have. It's why you're miserable with your family. And it's because the whole family structure is falling apart. It's why essentially most of the most intransigent problems of modernity are so deeply entrenched that they seem like unnegotiable facts, which have always been there. It's not just this luxuriant point. I always love what John Stuart Mill says. I believe it's at the beginning of his essay on Bentham and Coleridge. He says, to superficial men, theoretical philosophy is of all things the very furthest thing away from any direct relevance to them, or it's completely irrelevant. It's just somewhat for ivory tower intellectuals in their towers for no good reason. And he says, when in reality, it is the single thing, theoretical philosophy, which most influences the shape of their everyday life. It's just that they're completely unaware of it because they don't even understand that level of discourse and how it determines everything else. Just to give one example, our contemporary conception of freedom, right, which is essentially arbitrarist freedom, right, is responsible for, because it's the supreme value of modern liberal society, as Brad Gregory says, the supreme value of modern liberal society is freedom of choice per se, regardless of what is chosen, right? It's the reason that you have a problem with your children. It's the reason people have a problem in their marriage. It's the reason that people are scared about, influences on their children. It's the reason that people are unsure about and have doubts in their faith. It shapes our everyday struggles. It's responsible ultimately for why there are so many deep inequalities in the prevailing economic hegemon, right? The political problems that we face, they're rigorously determined by ascendant metaphysical doctrines in any given time.
Okay, yeah. So that reminds me of one of Dostoevsky's criticism of slavery in the guise of freedom. So in his Karamazov Brothers, he says in one of the paragraphs that modernity shouldn't have the hold of telling us what is true freedom for the human beings. He says it is nothing, the freedom that modernity is selling to our souls is nothing but the proliferation or multiplication of our desires or of our choices. And that has not brought freedom. He says clearly that has brought enslavement. And he actually gives the solution as to what is true freedom. He says true freedom could be found and lies in prayer, fasting, and obedience to God. Mm-hmm. And that is also related to one of the points that Soren Kierkegaard makes in his Sickness Unto Death, that he says, unless we ourselves obey and surrender to the power that has sustained us, that sustains us, we can never get away from the sickness of despair and despondency that has led to the exponential increase in suicide in the world. There has never been such a phenomenon, such a pandemic of people being bothered by their own self because it is not surrendered to the power that sustains us. So one of the serious critics against modernity from their own tradition, I would say, is Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, and also Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal, in his book, The Panacea, The Reflections, he was talking about morality and the belief in immortality. He says they should never be divorced. In order to have a sustained, consistent moral life, then we should never lose the belief in the hereafter. And with the collapse of a belief in the traditional metaphysics, including hereafter, then you no longer believe in a life that continues on, that survives our bodily death, our corporeal death. That all of these are interconnected, and we should actually fight in order to save a lot of souls that are being tormented by a loss of belief in the metaphysical, in the transcendentals, as such.
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, in my book, Hierarchy and Freedom, I'm essentially exploring the very point that you're making, which is that the so-called freedom that reigns today, what I call arbitrarist freedom, from the word arbitrary, but arbitrarist, right, is a disguised slavery. What we call individualism today is really a manipulated individualism. And it goes back in terms of commensurable doctrine to what Imam al-Ghazālī says in Mizan al-Amal, I believe it is, and what Plato says in the Republic, and that the great sages of all time have affirmed. What Imam al-Ghazālī says in Mizan al-Amal is that al-hurru fi at-tahqiq man qahara shahwatahu, right? The truly free person, when you investigate this matter properly, is the one who has vanquished who has overcome, has mastered his desires, his passions, right? It's not because passions are bad. It's not because anger is bad, right? It's not because the spirited faculty is bad. It's absolutely crucial to our moral sense. It's not that desire and the appetitive faculty are bad. That's how we do jalb al-manafi'. That's how we bring benefit to ourselves, and that is how it should be, and it must be. And, the spirited faculty is how we do dafa' al-madarra. It's how we ward off harm from ourselves, and that's, we need to ward off harm on an individual and a societal level, and we need to bring benefit on an individual and societal level. It's rather that if we are ruled by anger and desire, unregulated by intellect and the spirit, right, which in some sense are synonymous, it's a kind of the intellect is a kind of different resolution of the spirit. It's one of the powers of the spirit, according to Sadruddin al-Qunari, Quddus Sirruh. But if we are ruled by anger and desire, unregulated by intellect, then we're ruled by impulse and instinct. And we're not even capable of pursuing higher goals and genuine human flourishing, even if we wanted to, right? Mm-hmm. Even if we wanted to, we wouldn't be able to, right? Because man, as Shah Wali Allah says, is the meeting place of the angelic and the animal, right? That is also the ground of our taklif, because uniquely amongst beings, we are this isthmus or barzakh between a kind of angelic, intelligible, spiritual degree of existence on the one hand, and the realm of spatio-temporally bound corporeality on the other, the animal world. We literally bridge the two, but in and of ourselves, right, we're essentially these mirrors. We can either orient our mirrors up or down. And if we identify with the lower, okay, we don't have mastery of the lower so that it is properly ordered qua subordinated to the higher, we're not truly free. We are dictated to by a totalitarian tyranny of our desires and anger, but it's all within, right? And so, this is also what Plotinus is saying in 6.8 of the Ennead, which is also the, I think, chapter 3 or 4 in that book, that true freedom is freedom to pursue the good, right? And of course, in Platonism, the good is a metaphysical reality. It's not just a conceptual convenience, right? And that freedom can only obtain after purification takes place. Otherwise, it's impossible. So what we have today is people who are told, oh, there's no such thing as a higher self or a lower self. Don't be ridiculous. That's all metaphysical nonsense. They're trying to control you. You're free. Be free. Enjoy your freedom. And what do they mean? You own your body, right? That's what people think freedom means. Mm-hmm. And that's nothing to do with freedom. That's the most terrible slavery, right? So, because it denies everything which is most fundamental about human nature. Okay? And it allows us to be very easily manipulable. If we're told, oh, there's nothing really, there's just the material world and your desires and getting what you want. And you need all the stuff that we're telling you need in our media and advertising. Mm-hmm. Right? And then everyone says, well, I'm free to choose it. And that's really good. And then they spend their lives trying to accumulate this manufactured consumer delusion, which is all about peer pressure and appearances and keeping up appearances and keeping up with the Joneses. So yes, I agree. Yeah.
To your point, I just want to talk about the individual deification, like deifying, making a god ourselves, right? But there was a Mount St. Nursi in one of his books, I think The Words, he talks about how so long as there is self-ownership, thinking that you own yourself, you own your actions, you own everything, the total opposite of an occasionalist understanding. He says, wisdom will melt immediately once it is hitting the agent. That's very curious to me when I read it. He said, wisdom could never be sustained in a soul that thinks he or she is God. Yeah, and I think that is the mark of modernity. And even in academia, I mean, the self-ownership of things. Having written this book, this came from myself. I think prior to the modern era, the classical writers from both Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and I would say even in the Indian subcontinent religion, is this some sort of an inspiration from the higher levels of reality. And there's a gradation in reality that is structural, that is fundamental, that is not something mentally imposed and projected onto there, right? Mm-hmm. And once it is taken out, we are living in a flattened world, that everything is flattened, is horizontal. So there is no intimate encounter with a vertical world, neither without nor within. Mm-hmm. So it's very saddening to me when I see that people actually lose hierarchy. And I want you to explore a little bit on intrinsic hierarchy, metaphysically, and why is it important as well as a psychological reality after taking on the metaphysical side of it?
Absolutely. Well, that's very interesting you ask about its psychological reality, and I suppose we'll touch on that a little bit because I think it's very relevant to the times that we're living in, the types of very widespread problems that you see people going through on personal levels and on community levels. But hierarchy is not fundamentally a psychological principle, of course. It's a principle of reality. And the traditional understanding of hierarchy is that it's intrinsic, right? The intrinsic structure of reality is hierarchical. Now, essentially, it's very, very important for us, and I think the most essential difficulty for us as modern people in understanding this is that we are so imbued on a very, very deep level deep down in our souls with assumptions about what is knowable, right, what is subjective and what is not, that we are inclined to say, oh yes, I mean, all this hierarchy stuff, it makes a lot of sense. It will give us better lives. But still to view it as somehow a choice or a faith position, not something that can be proved. Okay? We would still tend to think as modern people, I'm talking about the dominant modern mindset, that when it comes to what is true about reality, the only way to find that out is from science. Science will tell you that. What I'm trying to tell you is it's something very dangerous, because we can have a fully certified, fresh, sound Islamic creed on paper. I believe that, etc., to the end of the creed. But hold a metaphysical, and by extension epistemological, belief that we can't know, even in principle, whether that creed is true or not. Do you see the danger of it? Because the person saying, I believe that, but there's almost this hypocrisy that in their view, their metaphysical view about what is knowable, they don't believe in it. They don't really believe in it, because they don't believe it's a verified truth. They believe it's a choice. They believe it's a choice, and it's not a choice. The choice aspect is one small part of it, right? Assent, which is tasdiq, is being forced to believe something by the evidence, by the nature of reality. It's not a choice, because someone can choose to believe in Orthodox Christianity, right? And they choose because, well, Islam was nice, but, you know, that guy, the monk that I saw, he had a nice beard and really nice incense, and he was really kind to me, and he had a nicer smile, and he seemed more gentle, right? Now, is that a good reason to have tasdiq in Christianity? No. And yet, if we don't believe in traditional natural theology and the fundamental metaphysical knowability, right, of the fact of the matter in that regard, in that dimension that transcends the empirical, then at the end of the day, it's an arbitrary choice, one way or the other, which religion you choose. Okay, so it's a very, very, I'm relating this to hierarchy, but I'm showing you how this affects everything, even things which are much more obviously important than hierarchy. You know, you might say, well, hierarchy is nice, but who cares whether you can really know it objectively or not? I'm telling you, if you don't think you can know it objectively as something real, have incontrovertible knowledge. What do I mean by knowledge? What's ilm in our tradition? Sifatun tujibu tamyizan la yahtamilu an-naqid. That's knowledge in our tradition. Okay? It's a property of the knowing subject. You acquire knowledge, right? That tujibu tamyizan, which entails discriminating between different realities. Okay? Acknowledging, apprehending distinct realities. La yahtamilu an-naqid, in which for it not to be true is inconceivable. It's not within the realms of possibility. Okay? And the traditional understanding is that that kind of certain yaqini knowledge is possible not only in some sort of very, very limited sphere of knowledge related to physical reality, but in metaphysics, and in truths about ethics, and in truths about aesthetics, and in truths about psychology, right? All across the human sciences, right? And hierarchy is just one aspect of that. So if you look at my book, Hierarchy and Freedom, the second chapter is about the logical structure of Platonic hierarchy. It's about the deduction of hierarchy. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the point is, in the traditional world pre-Kant, the understanding is hierarchy is intrinsic. Okay? It is the actual nature of reality to be hierarchical. And we can know that absolutely for certain. Right? So, for example, in the Platonic tradition, you have the elements of theology by Proclus. Neoplatonism dominates philosophy for 600 years, right? And it's only in the Middle Ages that really Aristotle becomes ascendant, although it's still with a large mixture of Neoplatonism. So Proclus's first proposition of the elements of theology is pan plethos metechepe tu henos. Every manifold in some way participates unity or participates in unity. And that unity, that principle of unity, which gives the intelligibility to the manifold, cannot be immanent. It's not merely the individual, because the individual presupposes that it already exists, that principle of unity, in order to be what it is. So it's a transcendent principle of unity. Okay, so that is one aspect of a deduction of hierarchy, is seeing the one over the many and realizing that that one over the many that gives being and intelligibility to particulars is not itself a particular, but something transcendent that the particular must participate in order to exist. So we've already deduced a higher level of being. That's just one small part of the argument. For example, in the Akbarian tradition, you have in Sadr al-Qunwi, كل متعين يقتضي سبق لا تعين عليه. Right? Every instance of determinacy entails the existence of that of which it is determinate. Okay? Right? And so on. So, for example, in that chapter, the point I'm trying to make is the Enlightenment critique of hierarchy is that it is not real, it's not really there. People are pretending it's the structure of reality when it's actually only conventional, right? Mm-hmm. It's created by people who choose to create it and pretend it's there, motivated by power interests because they want to control you, right? That's not the traditional conception at all. The traditional conception is not about enshrining one part of society as controlling the other and then pretending that that's just an intrinsic fact of existence and you're just going to have to put up with it and get over it. That's not what it's saying at all. There was more social mobility in the Middle Ages than there is now. That's a fact. There are many studies about this. What it's saying is something much more basic. What it's saying is that intellect is intrinsically superior to impulse and instinct. That's hierarchy. Okay?
Right.
What it's saying...
tripartite. Tripartite understanding of Plato, right? The vegetative, the spirited, and the intellectual.
Yeah, exactly. The appetitive. So, what it's saying is that the incorporeal, okay, governs the corporeal. It doesn't mean the corporeal is bad. It's just that it's governed by the incorporeal. Okay? The meaning, okay, is superior to arbitrary chaos. Right? That is hierarchy. It's an intrinsic structure. Now, the point is, a society which is ordered in accordance with that metaphysical vision of intrinsic hierarchy will also take on a kind of hierarchy itself. But that's nothing to do with power interests. It's about trying to reflect the metaphysical structure of reality in society. It's nothing to do with Ahmed wanting to control me or something, right? By saying, oh, by the way, Hasan, you didn't know, but there's actually an intrinsic hierarchy where I'm superior. So that's fine, isn't it? Because that's just the way things are. So, which is the Enlightenment polemical image of hierarchy, which has nothing to do with the traditional conception of hierarchy. So hierarchy is very important because it's not about power. It's about us ascending to be the best that we possibly can, right? and recognizing something transpersonal, okay, about the structure of existence, where there is that which is closer to the divine and therefore superior, okay, and that which is less proximate to the divine, okay, is more distant from the divine rather, and is thus in a subordinate position with respect to that which is superior, and will attempt to, through a process of purification and ascent, reach the highest level possible. Okay? And it also means that there are aspects of human life in which authority structures which we consider now to be traditional authority structures are seen to be rooted actually in an intrinsic hierarchy, right? In a sense that the father and husband, right, in some sense has a hierarchical station relative, let's say, to the wife and mother, okay? Because of one aspect of his being, which means that he must be superordinate with respect to her, but at the same time, she equally, in a different way, occupies a higher place on the hierarchy with respect to him. You see, right. It's not a simplistic, we have this idea that somehow the pre-modern thing is this backward, patriarchal, simplistic understanding of hierarchy. But in fact, there are many ways in which the wife and the mother occupies a higher place in the hierarchy. But it's understanding how complementary properties of being relate to one another. And again, it's not about someone taking advantage of, somehow being hierarchical, occupying a higher place in the hierarchy intrinsically in order to enjoy being tyrannical. Because tyranny is not allowed by a genuinely participating in and modeling ourselves upon that intrinsic hierarchy. It rules out tyranny.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I cannot wrap my head around is without a belief in intrinsic hierarchy as a phenomenological reality, not just a belief with cognitive dissonance or hypocrisy, as you talked about, there could be no possibility for transformation. I mean, my case study is Leo Tolstoy in his Confessions. He literally says, whenever he was close to the world of evil behavior, evil inclinations, and acting them out, he says the world became lifeless and godless. Nothing appeared as a sign for me. And he said, the more that I made myself submitted to God, I tried my best to be away from the immoralities that he said I was engaged in for 50 years. He said, then reality appeared in a different way. So there's not this single objective reality that is accessible to all scientifically. That's also one of the problems of science, right? There's this only one level of reality and nothing more to it. And this is deadening to the soul because the soul is in a state of fluctuation, so to speak.
Exactly.
If there's a fluctuation, there's a presupposition of hierarchy, and this is natural, this is needed. We feel at home when we see ourselves rising. Even neurophysiologically, there are certain hormones that are responsible for positive emotions that get released when we notice ourselves moving towards a higher goal. I mean, everything on every level, hierarchy is something to be espoused for, and the rejection of it is nothing but the rebellious spirit of power itself. I mean, the whole idea of somebody being overly and excessively resistant to power is a soul that is rebellious to God's power, ultimately, I would say. Yeah. They don't want to give themselves to the all-encompassing power, because on the contingency argument, all power is kicked off from God. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, right now I'm holding this, right? The power is borrowed from, let's say, the arm here, then the shoulder, then I need the chair, otherwise I cannot be sitting, and then all the way as a vertical causality, the power is not generated by anything in the experimental reality.
Yeah.
Power is generated from God, so we should not be that much of resistant to legitimate power, I would say.
Beautiful.
So So I just wanted to take your thought on illumination and peripatetic philosophy. And I want to quote you quoting Coleridge that said a human being is either born Aristotelian or Platonic, right?
Yeah.
So there's truth, right? There's truth in the Aristotelian approach, but not the full truth, not the higher truth, I would say as well. So do you think the illuminationist approach in Islamic philosophy was more inclined toward the Platonic, and the peripatetic, obviously historically, were more prone to Aristotelian? And as well as a connection, a corollary to that, do you think the Akbarian metaphysical system was a branch of illumination philosophy, or is distinct and separate?
I view Platonism and Aristotelianism as being the two most fundamental, broad, opposed philosophical methodologies. And of course, there's much overlap, but they represent broadly the two most distinctive, opposed philosophical methodologies. I don't think that the harmonization of Plato and Aristotle is really much worth pursuing. And that doesn't mean that you can't use Aristotelian logical apparatuses, for example, or Aristotelian conceptual frameworks. But the point is, your metaphysical framework cannot be both Aristotelian and Platonist, because they are poles apart. I view the Ishraqi mashrab, or madhab, or school, madrasa, as synonymous with Platonism, right? That's also how Suhrawardi viewed it. When you look into the works in our own tradition, the founder of the Ishraqi school is not Suhrawardi, as you know well. It's viewed as Plato, or some people would say Pythagoras. But the point is, it's an ancient tradition, which is ultimately from the baqaya of the ulum of the Anbiya in the traditional understanding. Right. Right. So the peripatetic Masha'i approach is a very, very interesting tendency. As you said, Coleridge says every man is born either a Platonist or an Aristotelianism. The point is, it's a very, very fundamental human orientation. It's really an orientation of the soul. What are the most fundamental differences? The most fundamental differences are, in Platonism, there's an understanding that we are equipped with innate ideas, right? An innate knowledge of the incorporeal realm of the forms, the structure of reality, the inner meaning of things, because our perceiving spirit, the knowing subject, the spirit, the soul that knows, right? The knowing subject, which for Imam al-Ghazālī and Mishkat al-Anwar, he uses synonymously nafs and aql and ruh, as the point is, it's what differentiates us from animal perception, right? That distinctively human form of awareness, which is this kind of isthmusal potency to reflect a higher realm of pure meaning, or become identified with a world of limited sensible corporeality, with really this exigency built in to order those possibilities. And that is the meaning of being a Khalifa, which is that you order those human possibilities of orientation so that the higher governs the lower, and that the lower is elevated by being subordinated to the higher. But anyway, I digress. The point I was making is that the most fundamental difference between Aristotelianism and Platonism on one level is that Aristotle teaches that we are fundamentally a blank slate. So the soul is a blank slate, it's the tabula rasa. We don't know anything intrinsically, and as such, where do we acquire our knowledge from? Well, it all comes from the senses. You have the famous scholastic dictum, nihil est in intellectu, there is nothing in the intellect which is not first in the senses. So all of our knowledge comes via abstraction from sensible particulars, all of it. Everything starts with the physical senses in Aristotle, via abstraction, okay? Whereas in Platonism, we are equipped with innate ideas because our soul has a fundamental affinity with the spiritual realm, what Plato would call the world of forms or ideas, right? Because that is where the soul is from. It is literally, before it comes into the body, it's in the realm of forms or the spiritual realm, right? Which, commensurably in the Islamic tradition, you'd call alam al-arwah, right? So, and then once we come into the body, if we already know everything, you might say, well, why don't we know everything? Why do we have to learn everything? Why do some people not know if that's our nature? That's why knowledge, rather than abstraction, becomes recollection, right? Mm-hmm. How does so you're remembering your true spiritual nature. How do you remember? You remember by undergoing a process of purification. In our tradition, tasfiyah or tazkiyah, in the Greek, it's the word catharsis, which now in the modern psychology means something quite different, rather trivial compared to the original, although not unrelated. But catharsis is the word for purification. And the most basic form of purification is what we were discussing about the tripartite soul. Simply ordering your own soul so that anger and desire are regulated by, subordinate to, intellect, so that with your anger and desire, you're not harming yourself or others, but you're serving ultimate flourishing and the ultimate good, right? Intrinsic good, right? The good, okay? So this is what's so fundamental in the difference between Plato and Aristotle, is that for Aristotle, essentially knowledge is abstracting from sensible particulars and then using your logical apparatuses to manipulate what you've learnt from sensible particulars and to come up with your inferences and deduce what you deduce about the nature of the world, right?
But that presupposes the material world being the fundamental and the mental being the derivative. I think that's going to come at the cost of, downgrading the spiritual.
It's absolutely the case. Many people who don't understand Aristotle or are mistaking a Neoplatonic commentator for Aristotle become confused when Aristotle talks about contemplation in Book 10 of Nicomachean Ethics, or he talks about the agent intellect in the Anima. They become confused into thinking that Aristotle is basically the same as Plato, and what's the big deal? But Aristotle is a very, very strange creature when it comes to justifying the intelligibility of the world, okay? Because the intelligibility of the world for Aristotle is a kind of epiphenomenon, right? It's a kind of what, in modern physicalism, pseudoscience, but they wouldn't call it pseudoscience. I call it pseudoscience, which in modern physicalism is called an emergent property, right? Because exemplary intelligibility, right, is not there at the higher degrees of being, okay? The intellects that govern the spheres in Aristotle don't know anything, right? This is not a controversial point in Aristotle exegesis, because otherwise, if they knew something, if they knew the world, Aristotle would be Plato. The whole point of Aristotle is that he's not Plato. He reminds you on every page that he's not Plato, right? He says Plato was a good friend, but truth is a better friend, right?
Right.
His whole philosophy is based on the rejection of exemplary form. Intelligibility emerges under certain ontological conditions, as in those of the emergence of the sensible particular world, okay? Mm-hmm. The intellects that govern the spheres are causes of motion, right? At best, they know the sphere that they govern, and that is it, right? The prime mover in Aristotle doesn't know the world, right?
It doesn't originate as well. I think that just kicks off the motion, doesn't originate anything.
Exactly. And that's another very, very significant point as well. Thank you. So intelligibility is an emergent property for Aristotle. It's not a controversial point. The agent intellect is not thinking all of the intelligibles in Aristotle. What Avicenna chooses to do with the agent intellect later is his own business. It's not Aristotle, right? Absolutely not. At best, and it's very unclear what Aristotle actually thinks the agent intellect does, because he reserves 3 passages for it in De Anima, which are the most contested passages in the history of philosophy. But the most that it does is shine a light, right, so that the world is rendered intelligible such that we can know it. Okay? But it's, in that sense, like the sun that shines a light on the sensible particular world. Okay? The sun is shining a light and we can see the world, but that physical light is not creating the intelligibility, right? And the agent intellect is shining a light to make the intelligibility manifest to it, but it's not because it contains the exemplary forms in itself. It's shining a light onto the world so we can see the universality in the particularity, right? It's shining a light, more specifically, into our minds so that we can see that universality within the particularity. Now, of course, in Avicenna's version, Wahib as-Su'ar, which is the 10th intellect and is identified with the agent intellect, is both the bestower of form upon the extramental particular and giving us the corresponding universal. But the point is, what does Aristotle get tangled up in as a result of his incoherent account of ontology, or rather of the ontological grounding of intelligibility? He gets caught in what I call the supreme aporia of immanentism, right? And this is something acknowledged by Aristotle scholars everywhere. Okay, pick up any major scholarly work on Aristotle. I'm talking about contemporary works by major contemporary academic scholars of Aristotle, and you'll find this aporia mentioned in almost every book. It's not I'm just saying it's not a obscure problem. It is acknowledged that in metaphysics, Aristotle affirms, right, uncontroversially, he affirms, it's a fact. You can go and look at it for yourself. 3 contradictory statements. And he never deals with the problem. He just wants to have his cake and eat it. He wants all those 3 statements to be true, even though they're flagrantly contradictory. And those 3 statements are: substance is usia, right, what we call johar. Substance is form. Okay, he finally, after torturous worrying all throughout the metaphysics, he arrives at this conclusion of Metaphysics Zeta. He says, well, I finally decided that substance is primarily form. It's also matter, and it's also the composite of form and matter. Those are also all substance, right? And we inherit that in our tradition, as you know. But it's most fundamentally form, because what does substance mean? It means primary being. It means, what does it mean to be most fundamentally? What is the most fundamental ground or substratum, okay, of an individual existence? Okay, that is what the substance is. All the other aspects, the accidents which are changeable, the relationship it has with other things, those are not primary being. Okay, they're not what is the fundamental substratum of being. Okay, so he says it's form, because form is what allows you to distinguish one thing from another. It's the essence of a thing. And without something being what it is, in contradistinction to the thing that it's not what it is. So it's what is most fundamental to it being what it is its form. Okay? It's what gives it the intrinsic distinctness, which allows you to pick it out as that particular thing. This human being, for example. Human being. But for Aristotle, of course, only particular reality exists. So he says form, but he means immanent form. Okay? Right. So he means human being, human being, human being. He means for immanent form. Okay? So the first proposition is substance is form. Okay? Another proposition, and these are all they're laid out as propositions in metaphysics. Second proposition is form is universal. Okay, it's evident that form must be universal in Aristotle because the object of scientific knowledge is the universal, not the particular. So Hasan is a human, Ahmed is a human, Henry is a human, John is a human, etc. Okay, so it's universal, right? Right? We can abstract that concept, and it could apply to in principle, to an infinity of different instantiations. So, substance is form. Form is universal. Okay,
as an abstraction, like abstracting from the physical sensible.
Yeah, exactly.
That is how we know that it's universal.
Yeah, yeah. Substance is form. Form is universal. Okay. No substance is universal. Okay. These are the three contradictory propositions. So he wants to have his cake and eat it, as we say in English. When you want to have your cake and eat it, you've got a delicious chocolate cake, okay, and you're so proud that you have the chocolate, you want to share everyone the chocolate cake, right? But you want to eat it as well, but you want to still have it even though you've eaten it. And you can't. You either have it or you eat it. That's what I'm just explaining the expression for any of your viewers who might not know it.
Except if you're very rich.
Sorry?
If you're very rich and you've got a chocolate shop, right? You can just have the cakes.
Well, exactly, but
right.
but you wouldn't be able to have that particular cake.
Right.
That's the point.
Right.
So essentially, Aristotle wants to say the most important thing in reality is its intelligibility, right? It's the universal. It's what allows me to see the world as this world of variegated essences where everything's distinct and everything's objectively knowable. But he also wants to say, however, that intelligibility, it's not really there, right? Because the intelligibility is the universality of form, and it's not there. What's there is particulars, right? What is there in reality is particulars. The universal has no ontological status. Now, this is why I don't consider Occam to be the cause, unlike the kind of tragic Catholic traditionalist narrative about the emergence of modernity, where it's all the fault of nominalism, and because of original sin, they couldn't handle the high standards of the High Middle Ages, and it just had to deteriorate. And Occam, he couldn't understand the synthesis properly, and so it all just fell apart. Occam himself, I'm a big fan of Occam. Occam himself said, guys, don't blame me. Don't shoot the messenger. All I'm doing is giving you the real Aristotle. Okay? Now, I'm convinced that that's exactly what Occam was doing. Occam was just giving us the real Aristotle, which means, on my reading, what is really responsible for the emergence of modernity is not Occam and his naughty nominalism rising up against the High Middle Ages and Thomas Aquinas because everyone went crazy because of the Black Death or whatever it happens to be. It's actually Aristotelian immanentism itself. Aquinas was always going to turn into Occam, right, when he just got a bit wiser about the real implications of his thought. And that's my unpopular thought for the day. But I do believe that is the truth of the matter. that if there had been a real Platonism in that broad methodological sense, it's not about partisanship. Oh, I'm a Platonist, and you're, in that broad methodological sense, it would have never turned into Occam, because there are fundamental aporia within an adherence to Aristotle, such as you find in Aquinas. The thing about Aquinas and all these people is the same with Ibn Sina. People get confused because what people like Aquinas and thinkers like Aquinas and Ibn Sina do is they take the syncretists, they take little bits of Neoplatonism, little bits of Plato, little bits of scripture, and tack it all on with sellotape onto the rigid Aristotelian fundamental metaphysics and epistemological commitments, and immanentism, right, which is the idea that all reality is particular, and essentially our intelligible structures are parasitic upon the excremental particular. Now, Avicenna had aspects of his thought which were not fully coherent Platonism, but for example, the fact that the agent intellect, the 10th intellect, is thinking all of the intelligibles, had Avicenna accused of Platonism by both Aquinas and Ibn Rushd, very interestingly. So, there's a kind of syncretism. Ibn Sina gets the closest to being adequate, but there are still all sorts of aspects of his philosophy which really don't make any sense because the directionality is wrong. Everything's about abstraction from excremental particulars. In any case, it's a very, very complex area. But I think that this is really something that is worth reconsidering, this whole question of the emergence of early modernity and what was really responsible for it, kind of moving away from this slightly romantic traditionalist Catholic view that basically everything was fine. It was amazing, the High Middle Ages. It was the kind of ideal synthesis. Because of a few morally corrupt, evil, depraved individuals coming into ascendancy for one or another reason. I believe it's much more that the emergence of modernity was really inevitable and inexorably necessary because of the nature of Christian civilization in the Middle Ages, including its understanding of the sciences, because of its adherence to Aristotelian immanentism primarily, but also because of the very nature of Christianity. I mean, that's also what I argue in this book, The Unraveling of Intelligibility. Yes.
It's very interesting. There's a lot to absorb and process, and very interesting, insightful observations. I really appreciate it. I mean, Aristotle has been existing in different forms. Like he was like a shadow coming to the Islamic world, still carrying through. I think there's some providence as well in there, right? But the thing is, I think immanentism is immanence of God, or the reality of immanence subverted or inverted when the belief and the hold on the transcendence is lost. I think when we no longer engage with the transcendent, then what's left is only the immanent, because immanence in Islamic theology is important, right? I mean, the presence of God's names and attributes, so to speak, in the physical world. But if the transcendence is forgotten, then I think it's a metaphysical necessity that we will head long into immanentism. Starting everything. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because, usually when we say transcendence and immanence, we're talking about a theological mas'ala. Right. So it's important to distinguish the mas'ala we're talking about. It's not that they're unrelated, because for one thing, everything's related, but also there's a more specific relationship here. But what I'm saying when I say immanentism is not the same as the whole transcendence immanism, which, tanzih and tashbih, for example, in our tradition. There are similar aspects, but we're talking to a different masala. We're addressing a different intellectual question, really. So what I mean by immanentism might be summed up by saying al-wujudu yatawaqqafu ala at-ta'ayyun, right? Is to say that all that exists is particular reality, and that, or another type of immanentism would be Kantian immanentism. The idea is essentially is that the particular appearance, right, is exhaustive of all that can be known about the thing. The sheer fact of determinacy or particularity or individuation does not in and of itself reveal a superordinate degree of being that makes the appearance of the particular world possible. Rather, there's this kind of closure and self-contained claim that's made about the realm of particulars. As we were saying, in the broadly Aristotelian tradition, intelligibles are more or less parasitic upon the sensible particular. It's not that there's an intelligible world. We abstract intelligibles and maqulat, but they're from the particulars, right? And so that's how J.N. Findlay memorably describes Aristotle's position, and he's in a position to know. He says that it's essentially a doctrine that intelligibles are parasitic upon sensible particulars. In the case of Kant, immanentism essentially means that reality has a intelligible structure, right? It is knowable in a certain intersubjective sense, but that knowability does not reveal intrinsically anything higher, right? There's a kind of self-contained closure to explanation, right, where particularity doesn't reveal that in which it participates in order to get the intelligible content which allows you to recognize it as a particular under that universal, such that it's a distinct essence. Rather, it's just a particular. So it goes back to the same a priori we're talking about in Aristotle. Aristotle wants to say the object of scientific knowledge is the universal, but the universal is not actually there, right?
Yes.
So it generates aporia. The answer to that in the Akbarian tradition, in the Platonic tradition, is to say it is contradictory to say that the being and knowability of a particular from that given universal. Okay, so Hasan and Ahmed are particulars of human being. We are instantiations of human being. It is contradictory. For example, this is what Pesari says in this wonderful book, right? Which is his commentary on Fusus al-Hikam with his famous Prolegomena. It is contradictory to claim that the being and knowability of the particular, right, rests upon the universal essence, while at the same time claiming that the universal essence, in order to exist, requires the particular. Because on that doctrine, that broad doctrine of peripateticism and kalam, al-wujudu yatawaqqafu ala at-ta'ayyun. So an essence can only exist as an instance, right? It can't exist on its own, right? So it's just an abstraction. And so it's question begging, because the question then becomes, if the intelligible reality doesn't exist prior to the instance and it's exhausted by its instances, okay, then how is it that distinct instances emerge in the first place? Right? Because the particular can only be a particular of that given essence if the essence actually exists. You didn't create human nature, Ahmed. I didn't create human nature. If all the particular human beings on earth were ceased to exist, then on that doctrine of immanentism, the intelligible structure of reality would cease to exist as well. There'd be no ground for the emergence right, of a particular from that given universal. And this is why the Akbarian tradition says, for example, كل متعين يقتضي سبق لا تعين عليه, right? Every instance or every determination of an intelligible property reveals the necessity that of which it is determinant, i.e. the universal essence itself actually exists, right? That follows on Platonism. That's why we have a deduction of hierarchy as part of our episteme, a part of our demonstrative knowledge on Platonism. But that doesn't follow on Aristotelianism or Kalam, because on Aristotelianism or Kalam, okay, particularity allows us to abstract a universal, but that universal is not the prior ontological condition for the emergence of the particular. It's just a concept in the mind. You see? So we're stuck in this immanentism. The miracle of the intelligibility of the world on this immanentist view is not revealing a spiritual world to us.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the intelligible is prior to the sensible. And
in
we say
Platonism, broadly speaking, Akbarian,
in Platonism, yes.
Yeah, the particular is a branch of the intelligible. Yeah.
Can we say a derivation of the intelligible?
Can
we say the intelligible?
Derivation of the intelligible. And analogously, I wanted to say, and perhaps this is getting towards the end, but analogous, because it's very fundamental. Analogously, I wanted to say, when it comes to our structures of knowing, discursive knowledge, syllogisms, structures of deduction, patterns of inference. The point is, discursive reason, what the Greeks call dianoia, istidlal, where you have to move from premise to conclusion, right, is a branch or a derivation of noesis or intuitive reason. Okay? So again, for Aristotle, it's a very, very murky distinction which has no real ontological rooting and at best a very vague one. But in Platonism, it's very, very clear. The realm of intellect, which is the realm of forms, is the realm of nous, intellect, capital I intellect, okay? And that is the realm in which this intuitive intellect has a vision of all intelligibility, right? And when we see into the inner essence of an intelligible reality here, we are participating in that level of intellect. Discursive knowledge, dianoia, only emerges under conditions of soul. It's not in the level of being which is called intellect or the realm of forms. It's in the realm called soul, okay, which is the creative impulse of existence, as it were, to look at the intelligible content in the forms and to say, I want to create illimitable particulars which instantiate this intelligibility, right? It's at that level where soul thinks discursively, because discursive reasoning requires motion, right? You have to move from premise to premise. Kul jism mu'allaf, wa kul mu'allaf muhdath, for kullu jismin muhdath, right? It's a motion, but it's not a direct seeing, okay? When, for example, I intuit the pure concept of unity, I see it directly with my mind. Okay, that's intuitive rationality. Now, discursive rationality depends upon intuitive rationality, because the constituents of discursive rationality are the pure intelligibility provided by intuitive rationality.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, that reminds me of Suhrawardi's contribution of knowledge by presence, علم الحضوري, or presentational knowledge, as distinct from representational knowledge.
Yeah.
I think we're now in the tyranny of propositional, representational approaches to reality that has brought nothing but misery to the human psychology, I would say. So we have to reverse it back to the true course of things as saying that knowledge by presence is the way to go, and it is the way to get حق اليقين. I mean, علم اليقين is something that even Iblis has it, right? So this is never the end. This is never the destination. Could be the beginning, but we should be idealizing the approach of حق اليقين, that is an intimate encounter with reality, that is presentational, that could be achieved through discipline, purification, catharsis, as you said. I mean, these are all things, unfortunately, that we discuss about expressive individualism, because expressive individualism depends on eliminating every form of juhud, because we need a lot of juhud to actually get there. Because, like, there's no authority left to sort of tell us that we ought to really keep ourselves in check, purify ourselves, and be consistent even in the face of calamities, right? But individual expressivism just says express it without bounds, whereas we need bounds in order to really get to these kashfs, these unveilings, because all the people who had a lot of unveilings were the people of high spiritual discipline, right? They lived a life of asceticism, even like at least inward asceticism, right? So I think it's very unfortunate and hapless to see that the social imaginary, to use a Charles Taylorian term, that the social imaginary is one that does not allow for sort of keeping in check our impulses and desires and choices, but always reinforces this unleashing blindly of desires into a meaningless, unintelligible world. So I think that the two worlds that we're talking about, the materialistic, physicalistic, that's sort of, you're saying, spearheaded latently in Aristotle, is causing a lot of havoc and mayhem in the world that we're seeing. And we need a lot of things. And my finalizing question would be, for a seeker who would be watching us later, that is entangled in the frame of immanentism, how would they get out in order to have the taste and thought of spiritual realities that would keep them propelled forward?
How can a human being ever be happy? How can we be happy as human beings if there's no eternal horizon? There are all sorts of different starting points for how one gets out of this, and how one, if you're a seeker, you start to really make progress and transform yourself. One of them is experience, empirical, lived experience, which is to say, look at the consequences of this, what you're calling expressive individualism. It's untold human misery. It's unprecedented human misery. And you were talking about the suicide rate, and one could also add the mental health crises that dominate today, and confusion that reigns everywhere, and just the sense that as the years go by, everyone is getting more and more stressed and more unhappy, and life is getting more evidently unbearable and livable for a greater number of people. And you find that the technological revolutions that are taking place are isolating us, alienating us from each other, and so on. So, it's the realization that if our litmus test is human happiness and flourishing, something's gone awfully wrong here. The reality is that the human being can never be happy if there's not an eternal horizon, if there's not a possibility of transcending immanence, because just the sheer fact that we as human beings can conceptualize infinity, can conceptualize meaning, can conceptualize eternity, right? It's one of Descartes' more interesting arguments, is that the sheer fact that we are able to have that idea shows that it must have been caused by something that is itself transcendent. It's not something we would have been able to derive from immanence or particularity, to use our language. So that hunger, now, even if we're still on the level of saying, well, even if it's just subjective, it's clear that we need to, these concepts, these ideas, these principles, whatever you want to call them, of transcendence and ultimate purpose and eternality and there being something beyond ourselves and purification and so on. Well, even if they're not real or true or don't correspond to actual reality, they do seem to work to make people happy.
Right.
So that would be a first step. But of course, that pragmatism and prudentialism is not the traditional worldview, and it's not what will ultimately make people happy. That's why I always say a lot of what needs to be done today is izalat al-mawani', right? So we need to understand that our assumptions that vision of intrinsic meaning and wonder and significance to the world, and there being an afterlife, and there being fundamental value and purpose and intrinsic beauty and goodness and truth. The assumption that all of that is just ultimately your lifestyle choice. It's your inclination. It's subjective. It might be nice. It might make you feel better, but it's just therapeutic at the end of the day. Izalat al-mawani', or getting rid of the obstacles, essentially recognizing and then addressing and treating the conditioning and, frankly, brainwashing that we have undergone in virtue of our modern programming by the modern education system, modern media. Essentially, those fundamental assumptions, which are liberalist assumptions, positivistic assumptions, which are the air we breathe as we grow up in this world. Removing, challenging those assumptions and realizing that actually the transition that modernity made to having those as our fundamental assumptions was not a reasoned transition. It was very much a dogmatic transition, an imposed transition, determined primarily by social and political factors rather than evidence or human flourishing or proof. And as such, to start to be open to the idea that our fundamental vision of the nature of reality and its knowability may be fundamentally mistaken, right? And then, depending on the proclivity of the person, not everyone has an interest, right, let alone an aptitude in, very, very rigorous intellectual work. Those who do should pursue it, and they should learn traditional metaphysics, and they should realize that actually the traditional worldview has a deductive structure. When you compare the deductive, the intelligible, explanatory power of these traditional metaphysical systems with modern philosophy, you'd go for the traditional system all day and every day. They're much more powerful, right? They can root all of our human experience, our scientific activity in the modern sense, our ethical investigations, and in our psychological account of reality in a much, much more deeply satisfying way. And once you advance in understanding the actual epistemological structure of philosophy, you'll no longer be so interested in it, does it make me feel better or is it satisfying? You'll be able to see that it is the truth. And for those who don't have so much of an interest in technical philosophy, and I don't blame you, then that spiritual encounter, seeking out spiritual masters, being open to the idea that a single encounter with a true spiritual master can open your heart to a direct experience of the truth and reality of the unseen world. And that is enough to totally change your life. And one experience like that can make you see this is not blind faith or something I need to make an effort to believe in. This is more real than anything else that I can experience. Okay, so both of and the al-kabrit al-ahmar, as they say, what we really need most of all in this time are those two elements, the intellectual and the experiential, coming together. Because when we have those, we have a truly integrated worldview, a faculty holism, in which there is this single thread of intelligibility which runs through all of existence. And that is the real answer to the great challenges of our time. And it renders us totally impervious to the Kants and the Nietzsches and the Heideggers and of this world. You feel sorry for them, the Foucaults and the Buttons, rather than being threatened by them. And ultimately, that has to be our role as Muslims, is not apologetic or identitarian, but it's actually healing and uplifting and helping our fellow human beings from the West, for example, to finally overcome the terrible spiritual and moral and intellectual impasse at which they've arrived at this stage of human history.
Exactly. Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, countries like Britain and Japan having a ministry of loneliness is very telling about the state of affairs, right? You don't need a ministry of loneliness if things have not gone very wrong, right?
Yeah, no, quite.
We shouldn't.
Quite.
And in Islam, we've got the balance of the intellect and the heart, and we don't have any reason in order to deny reason to make room for faith. So with that, a final note, we're going to conclude our discussion. I really appreciate your munificence and generosity to bestow your time and knowledge and insights. I thoroughly enjoyed it myself, and I think I learned a lot. Was revealing things you said, and really do appreciate it.
Alhamdulillah, it was lovely. It was a great honor and a great pleasure.
The same for me, sir. So we're going to end it from here.